Wrestling has had a lot of champions that just make sense. Whether it be Steve Austin in his time spent as WWF champion, Gunther's recent reign with the Intercontinental title, or Rhea Ripley as Women's World Champion. But what about those title runs that none of us expected to see? The ones that are totally unconventional? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start with this topic than with our first subject, Vince McMahon, and the time he became WWF champion. Yes, while he's not someone with a lot of goodwill today, back at the turn of the millennium, Vince McMahon was considered the king of pro wrestling in many ways. And that was because he'd managed to turn the World Wrestling Federation into a pop culture powerhouse on not just one, but two separate occasions. Obviously then, such achievement can very easily give someone a big head and make them think they're the ultimate star of the show. And this appears to have happened to the boss in 1999, as it was at that point he became WWF champion himself. How did a 54-year-old non-wrestler end up entering the ring and winning the top prize the company had to offer? Well, this was during a time where swerves were the order of the day, and so that's how on the September 15th episode of SmackDown that year, McMahon came out to the ring to challenge then-champion Triple H to a one-on-one match, despite the fact he was supposed to be banned from television forever by that point. And by the end of the night, not only would Vince have fought the game, but with a little help from an unlikely ally in the form of Stone Cold Steve Austin, he would have beaten him and would have become the 51st WWF champion. And what kind of reign did the boss have after that? Well, a very short one, because presumably realizing he wasn't a wrestler then, he vacated the title on the next episode of Raw, drawing to a close one of the strangest and unlikeliest world title reigns of all time. Yes, to call this one unconventional would be an understatement, but it wasn't the only time Vince McMahon ever held a title in WWE. No, as it happened, he'd do the exact same thing almost a decade later in 2007, as that was when he became the ECW World Champion. Why did McMahon decide to book himself as ECW champion in the spring of that year? Well, because in kayfabe, he wanted to get the better of his chief rival at the time, Bobby Lashley. Yes, when the Battle of the Billionaires took place at WrestleMania 23, a battle which saw Vince McMahon and Bobby Lashley on opposing teams, it started a beef between both parties. And as the boss was not someone who was known to accept defeat easily, when the night ended with him getting his head shaved as a result of a pre-match stipulation, he began looking for any way he could to get his revenge. So that eventually led us to Backlash 1 month later then, a show where, after teaming up with Shane McMahon and Umaga to take on Lashley in a 3-on-1 handicap match, Vince found himself getting the clean pinfall at the end after his opponent was beaten down. And because he was the one to get the pinfall here, it made him the new ECW World Champion going forward. Sure, it wasn't the original ECW title. No, that one had died years prior. Instead, this one was the WWECW title. That said, it was still a stain on the legacy of that promotion for many, as back during the 90s, Extreme Championship Wrestling had stood as the antithesis to everything mainstream. So to see the boss holding even a version of that belt felt like a wrong to so many fans. Nonetheless, McMahon would go on to hold the title for a total of 35 days. Hell, at one point he'd even technically fit a successful title defense in there when, during the 3-on-1 handicap rematch at May 20th's Judgment Day, he'd walk out still the champ after Bobby Lashley failed to pin him specifically. Thankfully though, by the time One Night Stand rolled around in June, the reign of terror that was Vince McMahon as ECW World Champion finally came to an end. But what about another boss that won a world title? Well, for that, we need to look at the time that Vince Russo became the WCW champion. That's right, we're about to go back to WCW in 2000, one of the most maligned eras in wrestling history. And right amongst the top of the pile of bad moments was the time head booker Vince Russo became champ. How did such a thing happen? Well, with the company already on the verge of ending at this point after months of questionable booking, Russo decided that what was going to bring fans back into the fold in September of 2000 was one of his trademark swerves. And so, this was why on the September 25th episode of Nitro, he decided to pull a swerve for the ages when he booked himself into a steel cage match with then WCW champion Booker T. And this one ended with Russo coming out the winner after Goldberg speared him through the cage and allowed him to escape first and win the company's top prize. And given this was the same belt which had lineage going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt, it meant he was now right up there in the history books alongside the likes of Lou Thesz, Ric Flair, Terry Funk, and others. That's right, unconventional would certainly be the word used to describe this one. And what came next would be just as unconventional too, because like with Vince McMahon before him, after winning the title, Russo apparently realized he wasn't a wrestler, and so as a result, he wouldn't be able to defend it going forward. So that's what led to the October 2nd, 2000 episode of Nitro, a show where rather than announce who his first challenger was going to be, the King of the Swerves instead vacated the gold and told fans it would be fought over by Booker T and Jeff Jarrett later that same evening in the infamous San Francisco 49ers match. But as strange as this all was, a few months prior, an even more unconventional figure had held the gold, with this being none other than David Arquette. Yes, well, Arquette may have since gone on to train in pro wrestling and has had multiple respectable matches. Back in 2000, he was pretty much public enemy number one for wrestling fans, as this was when he became the de facto top guy in all of WCW. How did he do this? Well, it all happened on the April 25th episode of Thunder that year. This was when, in an attempt to boost interest for Ready to Rumble, the WCW-themed movie Arquette was starring in, Vince Russo decided to book him in a tag team match. A tag team match that would see the Hollywood star pair up with then WCW World Champion Diamond Dallas Page to take on the duo of Jeff Jarrett and Eric Bischoff. That said, there was a twist to this one, and the twist was that whoever scored the winning pinfall would leave the night as champion. So when things closed out with Arquette pinning Bischoff then, it meant that, against all odds, he was now the top dog in Atlanta. Needless to say, this led to a bit of a backlash as the unconventional nature of it was a little too much for WCW fans who had grown up on the old territory style, where the World Championship was treated like the be-all and end-all. So for the next 12 days then, fans let Arquette know exactly how they felt about him whenever he appeared on TV, and how they felt wasn't good. But at least it wouldn't last long, because once those 12 days were over, the Scream Star would have dropped the gold to Jeff Jarrett in a triple cage match at May 7th's Slamboree. Still, while it was ultimately short-lived, the damage this title run did was huge, as less than a year later, WCW would be out of business entirely. But then maybe it wasn't just the bad decisions of 2000 which were responsible for this, because even as far back as 1998, World Championship Wrestling were putting their titles on people who were even more unconventional, as this was the year Judy Bagwell became a WCW Tag Team Champion. That's right, Judy Bagwell, the mother of Buff Bagwell, a lady who wasn't a wrestler or a backstage figure. Hell, up until right before the angle took place, she'd never even been on TV. And sure, she wouldn't be the only family member of a wrestler who got involved in an angle over the years. We all remember The Miz's dad, after all, right? But at least The Miz's dad was never booked to become a tag team champion, the same of which cannot be said for Judy Bagwell. Yes, it was certainly an unconventional choice of Eric Bischoff's to have this nice lady enter a wrestling ring on the November 9th, 1998 episode of Nitro with one of the tag titles wrapped around her waist. But how did we get to that point? Well, in order to explain this, a little backstory is required. Basically, at Halloween Havoc a couple of weeks prior, Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell had won the tag titles from the Giant and Scott Steiner, but because Bagwell turned on his partner after the match and subsequently abandoned him, WCW management allowed Rick to pick a new partner going forward when defending those belts. And Rick would decide on Kenny Chaos, but when Chaos fell to injury, Steiner would be forced to pick a new partner again. And this time, hoping to engage in some psychological warfare with Buff, he picked his mother, Judy. That's right, even if she never really wrestled and instead mostly just stood on the ring apron, in the history books of WCW, Judy Bagwell will go down as a former World Tag Team Champion. And what makes this one even wilder is that she never even dropped the belt to anyone. No, in the end, the straps would be vacated in January of 1999 after Rick Steiner was legitimately injured too. But what about an unconventional tag team title victory by someone who had never even hit a ring before his debut winning the gold? Who are we talking about here? Why, Nicholas, of course. That's right, in the lead up to WrestleMania 34, Braun Strowman had decided he wanted to go after the Raw tag team titles then being held by The Bar. But because he didn't have a partner, and then Raw general manager Kurt Angle wouldn't let him challenge for the title solo, he was forced to spend weeks searching for a second, with this at one point leading to him introducing us all to his supposed twin brother, Brains Strowman. By the time WrestleMania came around, though, it wouldn't be Brains Strowman who was standing in Braun's corner. No, instead, he'd come out prior to the bout and announce he was going to pick a partner at random from the crowd. And despite this being a crowd which included the Rainmaker himself, Kazuchika Okada, as he was there to cheer on his friend Shinsuke Nakamura, in the end, Braun decided not to go with him and instead go with a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas. No, you didn't hear us wrong. What followed was the monster among men teaming with a child and proceeding to single-handedly win the tag team titles from the Bar, with this meaning that by the time things were all said and done, Nicholas would technically be the youngest champion in WWE history. Of course, because of his age and his school responsibilities though, Nicholas, who was in truth the son of WWE referee John Cone, would have to vacate the belts the following night on Raw, meaning we'd never get a chance to see him mix it up with the likes of the Usos and the New Day. Who knows, maybe one day, once he's old enough, he'll return to win back the belts he technically never lost? But until that time, Nicholas will remain one of the most unconventional champions in wrestling history. That said, for all his success, one thing he was never able to do was win a singles title, and that's something our next subject most certainly did. But then they went even further than that, because they became one of the rare women to hold male singles gold. Who are we talking about here? Why, Medusa, and her time as WCW Cruiserweight Champion, of course. Now, we don't think it was ever technically stated anywhere that the WCW Cruiserweight title was strictly a men's belt prior to 1999, but considering it was only men who had fought over it at this point, it was fairly reasonable to assume this was the case. Of course, this would all change on December 19th of that year though, because that was when former three-time WWF Women's Champion Medusa entered the fray. Yes, it was at the company's annual Starrcade show that Medusa stepped up to the plate and challenged then Cruiserweight Champion Evan Courageous one-on-one. And despite pretty much everyone expecting Courageous to walk out of this one the winner, once all was said and done, history would be made, as for the first time in WCW history, a woman would be holding that particular piece of hardware. Obviously then, this makes such a reign pretty unconventional, and this left her with a lot to prove going forward, something she immediately set about doing as over the 28 days which followed, she'd defend against all comers. Unfortunately for her though, this was the dawn of WCW 2000. So as you can probably guess, her run on top was always going to end in disappointing fashion. And that's how we ended up with a situation where at January 16th's sold-out pay-per-view, the former Alundra Blaze would do the job to Oklahoma, a parody of Jim Ross, played by Vince Russo's writing partner Ed Ferrara. But what about the time another woman held Cruiserweight gold in WCW? As only 6 months after Medusa became the inaugural female Cruiserweight champion, Daphne would become the second. That's right, Daphne, someone sadly missed by all wrestling fans today, as she was truly great when it came to creating a character and getting it hugely over with fans. And it was her very overness which led to WCW deciding to go with her as a champion. But as they didn't have a women's title back in 2000, it meant the gold Daphne would win would be a men's belt instead, with this being the Cruiserweight title. And the way she won this one was by teaming up with Crowbar to take on Tammy Sytch and then champion Chris Candido in a mixed tag bout on the May 15th episode of Nitro, with the stipulation here being that whoever got the win would be crowned the new champion. Of course, because both Daphne and Crowbar were the victors once all was said and done then, it meant they'd be co-champions going forward. Or at least they would be for a while, because with neither wanting to share, they soon decided a match was going to have to take place between them to see who the real champ was. And this led to the May 22nd episode of Nitro just 1 week later where, after doing battle with each other, Daphne ultimately came out on top and secured her spot as the undisputed Cruiserweight champion going forward. How did things fare for her after that? Well, it was WCW 2000, so it wasn't great. No, after holding the title for a grand total of 15 days, she'd drop it to Lieutenant Loco, aka Chavo Guerrero Jr., on the June 6, 2000 episode of Thunder. And after that short reign then, Daphne's time in the title picture of WCW would come to an abrupt end, with her never getting another sniff at the gold before the company folded in March of 2001. But this wouldn't be the last time a woman held the WCW Cruiserweight title, or the belt it later morphed into, the WWE Cruiserweight title. No, as it happens, that latter incarnation of the gold would be later won by none other than our next subject, Jacqueline. And also as it happened, this run would heavily involve Chavo Guerrero Jr. again, as it was he who Jacqueline both won the belt from and eventually lost it back to. It all started in the spring of 2004. That was when Chavo, in the midst of his third run with the Cruiserweight strap, started believing he was just too good to be defeated. So, because he was convinced he could beat any given person on any given night then, he decided he didn't even need to prepare for his opponents ahead of time. Rather, all he had to do was put out an open challenge and see who answered. And on the May 4th episode of SmackDown that year, it would be Jacqueline who answered, with her from there making short work of Guerrero and becoming the third woman to hold this particular belt. Sure, you could make the argument that once 3 women had held the men's title, it stopped being unconventional for them to do so, but let's not forget, this was the first time it happened with the Cruiserweight title in WWE, so it was unique in that sense. Sadly for her though, this run would ultimately be cut short when, during the rematch with Chavo at May 16th's Judgment Day, he'd be able to get the better of her via devious means. So, like that then, the reign of Jacqueline came to an end, as did the reign of women in general with the Cruiserweight title. But this wasn't the only time a woman won a men's singles title in the Fed, of course. No, years prior to that, in 1999, the first person to ever do so would come around when Chyna became Intercontinental Champion. That's right, if you're an Attitude Era fan, then you'll likely remember this one, as at the turn of the millennium, where there was no woman who felt more like a force of nature than her. Seriously, for as much as someone like Rhea Ripley has gotten over today, she's arguably still not as popular as the ninth wonder of the world was. And part of the reason Chyna was so popular was because she was so believable when it came to her beating up the men around her. In fact, it was this very ability to dominate her male counterparts which eventually led to WWF deciding to do something with her which had never been done before. It all started in the summer of 1999 when, while in the midst of a chauvinist gimmick, then Intercontinental Champion Jeff Jarrett began drawing the ire of Chyna, with her at this point deciding she wanted to put him in his place not only by beating him, but by taking his gold away. And that all led to the showdown between them at October 17th's No Mercy where, in a Good Housekeeping match, the ninth wonder of the world was able to pin the heel and start her first reign on top. What happened after that? Well, considering how legitimate she felt, Chyna went on to have a decent run with the secondary prize. In fact, at one point, she'd even get involved in a notable program with Chris Jericho that saw the pair become co-champions for a while. And even when that run came to an end with Y2J getting the better of her and becoming the undisputed IC champ, this wouldn't be the last time Joanie Laurer held the gold. No, a year later in 2000, the same thing would happen again when she beat Val Venis to start her second run on top. That said, this run would be pretty short-lived as her on-screen boyfriend Eddie Guerrero would end up stealing the belt from her before all was said and done. And with that, Chyna's time as IC champion was over. But as we've seen with some prior examples, she wasn't the only unconventional champion of the Attitude Era. No, there were plenty of others, like the time Shane McMahon became European champion. Now, we know Shane has wrestled a fair amount over the years, but he was never a full-time wrestler. No, he's more of a member of management who's occasionally taken to the ring himself, much like both his father and his sister. And this was doubly true back in 1999, as back then he'd barely wrestled at all, which was exactly why it felt like such an out-of-the-ordinary decision to make him European champion. And so it came to pass then that on the February 15th episode of Raw that year, as part of the corporation's ongoing feud with D-Generation X, Shane O'Mac and Kane would team up to take on Triple H and then European champion X-Pac with the title on the line and to be awarded to whoever scored the winning pinfall. And it was Shane who scored the winning pinfall here and as a result, less than a year into his in-ring career, became a champion. However, the son of the boss proved to be pretty entertaining with the gold going forward, whether that be during his promo segments or his trademark stunt show matches. So it was almost a shame when his reign came to an end on March 30th, 1999 after he retired the belt. However, it wouldn't be retired for very long, as not long after this, Mideon found the belt inside Shane's bag and decided to keep it as his own. But even if his run was now over, it would remain fondly remembered as time went on, because the sight of a young Shane McMahon parading around with the European title was almost as entertaining as the sight of an older Shane McMahon crashing and burning spectacularly at WrestleMania 39 when he tried to do a leapfrog over The Miz. But let's move away from this belt for now and instead return to the Cruiserweight title, as there's still one unconventional championship reign in this particular piece of hardware's lineage, which we haven't yet discussed, and that's the time it was held by Hornswoggle. Yes, we know Hornswoggle was always technically eligible to win the Cruiserweight title given his weight class, but that doesn't mean people looked upon it as any less strange of a decision when WWE decided to have him do so in July of 2007. And the reason for that was because while he'd always been a semi-active wrestler, Dylan Postal was more of a manager-type performer than anything else. And what made this one doubly attention-grabbing was the fact that Hornswoggle would be the last person to hold the belt before it was deactivated a couple of months later. That's right, after beating Chavo Guerrero at July 22nd's The Great American Bash pay-per-view that year, Hornswoggle would keep a stranglehold over the strap until September 25th, at which point then SmackDown acting general manager Vickie Guerrero decided to strip him of it. Why had she done this? Well, as Hornswoggle had just been revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son, he was deemed to be too much of a target going forward, with her belief being that if he stepped into the ring as a champion again, someone was going to purposefully hurt him in order to gain some leverage over the boss. In fact, it wouldn't be until almost a decade later that we'd see the belt revived, this time with a whole new lineage. And by that point, there was no more Hornswoggle around to serve as an unlikely champ. But even if he's not able to have that unconventional title reign anymore, we're pretty sure there will be plenty of other out-of-the-ordinary picks to come as time goes on yet, because if wrestling has taught us anything, it's that sometimes what seems like the wrong pick can actually be the right one.